I was in the 6th grade. I would be taking a new English class, and of course, I would have a new teacher. I was incredibly excited. And he was great. I learned how to write better essays, and I was exposed to several new novels throughout the school year. In fact, I quickly became one of his favorite students. I looked up to him quite a bit. But in between the grammar and the vocabulary lessons and during our weekly class discussions, he would always end up discussing everything but literature. Star Wars, his extensive weapon collection, and naturally, his incredibly reactionary political beliefs. More specifically, his remarkably anti-feminist beliefs, all backed up with misinterpreted verses from the Bible and made up anecdotes, statistics, and facts about women. At first, of course, I wanted to agree with him. I had always admired my English teachers and loved their classes. I didn't want this to change. But I was feeling so incredibly alienated within his class, particularly when he criticized feminist values. One day, he would openly praise my work to the rest of the class, and the next, he would harshly criticize female politicians, reducing them to their gender and their audacity in calling themselves feminists. Even today, I can't help but wonder, did he ever realize that he was talking about me? Did he ever realize that he was talking about many of my classmates? Now, I had always considered myself to be a feminist. I never actually questioned this until the 6th grade. I can distinctly remember reading ahead in my 4th grade American history textbook about the first of feminism and determining that I ought to consider myself a feminist as well. I was raised in a very Christian environment, so I have always highly valued the principles of equality and justice. I knew that all people ought to be treated with kindness and with respect. So to my 4th grade self, who recognized these values within the simple textbook definition of the feminist movement, I thought this was common sense. Something not even worth mentioning. The characters in all of my favorite books weren't dictated by gender roles, but by their moral character, as they should be, right? So I never thought to reconsider feminism until the 6th grade, until my English teacher, my excellent English teacher, decided to openly disparage feminists and other forward-thinking ideologies, alienating me and, as I would later discover, many of my classmates in the process. Now, I'd like to ask you to consider that these experiences of mine likely aren't unique at all, that many women have been made to feel the exact same way, maybe even the women closest to you, your wives, your daughters, your coworkers. So why am I speaking with you tonight? Truthfully, any woman, if so inclined, could be giving this speech. These experiences of mine are undoubtedly universal. I'm not the only young woman impacted by the stigma surrounding feminist thought, far from it, but I am the one speaking with you tonight. So, before I ask you to reconsider feminism, and I will, I have to ask you to consider how we may have, knowingly or unknowingly, contributed to the stigma in any way. How might we have affected the women closest to us, women so integral to our communities, who may have never had the courage to question whether or not we ought to reevaluate our perception of feminism? Now, let's address this perception. Many of my peers seem to misunderstand the very definition of the feminist movement. I have overheard dozens of conversations in which my classmates state the disgust with feminism. But if they were asked if they would stand up for their mothers or for their sisters, they would say yes. Of course they would. And they would be feminists by the very definition of the word, simply because of their love and their regard for the women in their lives. This love is essential for the feminist movement, really. It's essential for every well-meaning social movement. While this simple explanation of the movement may not be the most technically correct one, it defines what is so simply important about it. Equality, a lack of division between men and women, and a genuine care for all other human beings. There are, of course, so many other instances of this misunderstanding. Friends of mine have told me that they would consider themselves to be feminists, but that modern feminism is inherently flawed. It's gone too far. And they don't want to align themselves with this by self-identifying as feminists. So often, people that I care about begin sentences by assuring me, I'm not a feminist, but, and end them with decidedly feminist statements in favor of equality. I'm not a feminist, but something really needs to be done about sexual harassment. I'm not a feminist, but women really ought to be paid the same as a man for any particular job. I'm not a feminist, but how many of us have heard, really, how many of us have said this exact phrase? You see, most people support the values that are the basis of feminist ideologies, but are entirely unwilling to align themselves with the movement. Instead, they remain complacent. They reassure themselves that society will keep marching along towards a more equitable future, but refuse to count themselves in and do something, do anything. Feminist and feminism each have a complex connotation, so many have entirely refused to associate themselves with these words, with this simple promotion of equality between men and women. For many, it's far too radical. So, why is this the case? Why are so many men and women completely unwilling to align themselves with the feminist movement? Of course, this is a complex question, and for the answer, let's look through history. Early feminist activism, think the Seneca Falls Convention, voting rights for women, the temperance movement, received the most widespread opposition at the time, but its influence is now generally considered to have been beneficial. However, opposition to the second wave in the 60s and 70s, think the feminine mystique, the fight for economic and social equality, Gloria Steinem, particularly opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment, is much more interesting. The ERA directly stated that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It was remarkably simple. How could anyone actually argue against this simple idea of equality between men and women? Well, Phyllis Schlafly could, and she did. She was the primary opponent of this amendment in the 60s and 70s. She used her authority as an activist to encourage women to abandon their dreams and their ambitions. Instead, she encouraged them to serve their husbands and serve their families as housewives. Schlafly was notoriously anti-feminist and opposed the pro-ERA activists through the moral majority movement. She argued that religious, moral women didn't have to deal with the same issues as feminists did, stating that, and I quote, "Sexual harassment on the job is not a problem for virtuous women." How many of us have experienced, how many of us know someone who has experienced sexual harassment in the workplace? Well, according to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, at least 38% of all women have experienced this. Schlafly, essentially, said that 38% of all women were inherently immoral, that the feminists working to fix this problem weren't virtuous. You would think that any proud Christian would be a part of such a movement, right? These religious and pro-family arguments gradually, little by little, worked to convince a majority of the American people that feminists were inherently immoral and unchristian, even though these feminists advocated for the very same values of love and equality that Christianity claims to promote. However, no one has contributed to the discreditation and demonization of feminists quite as effectively as the ridiculously popular talk radio show host Rush Limbaugh. As is well known by fans of the late Limbaugh, he consistently worked to discredit progressive beliefs by constantly disparaging his progressive opponents. Feminists, gay activists, really, anyone promoting justice for any marginalized community. Of course, I could cite hundreds of these instances. One, however, is particularly noteworthy within this context. In 2012, Sandra Fluke, a Georgetown law student, testified under oath to Congress in support of adequate access to birth control. She cited the experiences of a friend who suffered greatly from a polycystic ovary syndrome as a result of this. In response, Limbaugh, instead of actually attempting to refute Ms. Fluke's arguments, continually sexualized and attempted to humiliate her on his radio show, calling her a feminazi, a slut, and a prostitute. He willingly used his power, his authority, and his voice to repeatedly disparage others, attempt to restrict their rights, and ruin their reputations. all without a semblance of rational, logic-based argumentation. You would think that we Americans would openly oppose him. After all, Limbaugh repeatedly insulted women. Women, half of the population. Indigenous peoples, racial minorities, our brothers, our sisters, our people, our fellow Americans. You would think that we'd fly to our feet, outraged, standing up for one another. After all, we're Americans. It's what we do. In 2020, Rush Limbaugh was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for these very contributions to the United States, for calling Ms. Fluke several incredibly derogatory names, for mocking those suffering from AIDS, for repeatedly using racist stereotypes to attack his political opponents. He was awarded the highest civilian honor possible. His show appealed to a shocking majority of Americans who believe that his self-proclaimed moral and patriotic statements were ultimately beneficial to our country. Personally, I was first introduced to Rush Limbaugh when I was in the 2nd grade. My dad handed me a copy of Limbaugh's new children's book on the first Thanksgiving. Grateful, I read it in a few hours. And a few years later, I read his second children's book as well. I love them. From about this point on, I knew that my dad was a massive fan of Rush Limbaugh, and that he respected his opinions and his business sense quite a bit. I did not, however, understand Limbaugh's beliefs until a few years later, after his death, when I started reading more about him. Understandably, I was surprised. After all, my dad has never treated me differently than my brother. He's always encouraged me to achieve whatever I set my mind to. He's an excellent dad. One day, he would take the time out of his incredibly busy day to help me with my math homework, and the next, apparently, he would listen to Limbaugh's hateful rhetoric and actually enjoy it. Again, I can't help but wonder if he ever realized that Limbaugh was talking about his daughter. Truly, I don't think he meant to listen to someone who repeatedly disparaged feminists, the activists advocating for his daughter's rights, but he did. And this doesn't seem to be a solitary experience in the slightest. A quick search on the internet shows exactly this. Limbaugh had a profound influence on his listeners, yes, but had perhaps just as much of an influence on the loved ones of these listeners. So, the natural question, how on earth did this one man have such a significant impact on the American people? On Limbaugh's radio show, patriotism became a tool to criticize those he simply didn't agree with. The term patriotism, generally meaning a devotion to one's country and a willingness to work to improve it, came to mean an idea entirely contradictory to the founding principles of our country. Even today, patriotism has a certain connotation that it was never meant to have. And Limbaugh's usurpation of patriotism has impacted the perception of feminism in America today, turning it from a movement simply promoting love, equality, and justice to one akin to the Nazis' racist, violent, and hateful ideology. But you are an audience primarily composed of Americans, patriots even. You understand these most basic values of equality and justice and the importance of liberation from oppressive regimes of every kind. Thousands of Americans have given their lives for these very principles. And no matter political affiliation, nearly every American would agree with these values. After all, they were the very ideals upon which the United States was founded. So why are we still so hesitant to call ourselves feminists, to advocate for these most basic, inherent values? A few years ago, a friend of mine confided in me about her own struggle to open up about her beliefs to her parents, her teachers, and most of her friends. She described the alienation that she felt at her school, and it reminded me so much of my own experiences in middle school. The alienation, the fear of change, and the almost overwhelming loneliness within my own community. She felt that being honest about herself would lead to ostracization. And it certainly would have. Everyone she loved, everyone she looked up to the most, would no longer see her in the same way or trust her at all again. She'd heard what these loved ones had said about others just like her. And did they mean to say these things to target her? Of course not. But they said them. And she was silenced. by the people she needed the most. I hope we can all agree that no one should be made to feel this way, as if they can't be honest and open about their passions and their beliefs, especially to those they love and look up to the most. I no longer feel this way, but I used to, and it was devastating. We can't let the stigma associated with feminism exist within our communities any longer. So, I ask again, are we, as individuals, as a community, and really, as a country, contributing to the stigma in any way? Are we preventing the women we love and consider essential to our lives from fully expressing their beliefs, from fully living? And what can we do to end this long-withstanding stigma and misunderstanding of feminism itself? The answer is simple, and it's fair. We need to reconsider feminism. After all, it isn't exactly a radical idea. Thank you so much for including me tonight.